welcome back to Two Creations, One Creator. I am your host, Isaac Bush. Today, joined by a professor, the head of Campus Ministries, and a preacher at Cornerstone Church, Jacob Ratliff. Jacob, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's been an interesting morning.
Hmm.
Uh, had some truck issues, but I'm here
Yeah.
and
Hey,
excited to be here.
praise the Lord. Praise the
Yeah,
Lord. I'm sorry to hear about your truck dilemma, but
beater with a heater.
here with
Blessed,
the heater.
greatly blessed.
Absolutely. That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
That's a great way to look at it. How's your week been, man?
Oh yeah, it's been good. Honestly, it's hard to believe it's just Tuesday. Yesterday felt like 3 days packed into one. Lots of moving parts getting ready for fall break, but really good. How about you?
Oh, absolutely. The same way. It's been a long week and we're only 2 days in. So,
Yeah.
always means something eventful. Had a great weekend though. Went down to Tennessee, so that was pretty
Yeah.
pretty lovely.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But yeah. So, without further ado, if you wouldn't mind giving us your testimony, as short or as long as you would like, as deep as you'd like to
For
go,
sure.
it's up to you. But let's tell the audience a little bit about yourself, man.
For sure. Yeah, I'll give a brief version and then we can go into different parts throughout
Mhm.
the conversation. But basically, grew up in a Christian home, so both my parents are believers. This is something that over the last few years I've added as part of my testimony to really key in on. Neither one of my parents grew up in a Christian home, and I think that has a lot to do with my testimony. They both came to faith while they were teenagers. My mom through a bus ministry, and my dad because his parents just wanted him out of the house and would send him to church just to get rid of him, basically, which sounds terrible. Great, love my grandparents. They came to faith later in life, but that is a piece of my testimony is that both my parents didn't grow up in Christian homes, and so they missed out on a lot of discipleship when they were younger. But they really prioritized that for me and my sister. They really passionate about their faith because they came to faith later and they wanted us to grow up in a Christian house. And so, from a young age, I was at church every time the doors were open. Um, and definitely at a young age, started to feel the tension of, hey, I do believe in a God and I believe that Jesus is the way to God. I didn't fully understand that. I remember the earliest times of hearing the gospel being when I was about 6. We would go to church with my grandparents, which, like I mentioned, they came to faith later in life. My grandfather was really sick, and the church that they were at, they would take communion every week. So we'd go visit them, we'd go to church, and I'd see them taking communion. And I wasn't a believer yet, so my parents would tell me, "Hey, don't take communion." I remember the earliest time hearing the gospel, just being like, what is this snack that we have during church and why do we do that? And so my mom took that as an opportunity to share the gospel. I was probably about 6. And that's when it started to like mess around in there and like started to
Mhm.
think about what does it mean to be a Christian? And so when I was 8, made a profession of faith in Christ, and I believe that was genuine. Um, Definitely at 8 years old, you don't understand everything, but I understood that I was a sinner in need of salvation.
Mhm.
I placed my hope in Christ. From that time, just a lot of really big milestones. Try to keep those brief, but one big one was middle school. So in elementary school, I was blessed to go to a private school, really
Mhm.
solid Christian school, taught the Bible. And then in middle school, that school was shutting down. And so my parents made the decision to send me to public school. I remember this being one of the first times that I saw pride come out of myself in a
Mm.
really negative way of my attitude was, "Oh, I have to go to school with those people." I literally said that to my mom at one point, and she really humbled me in it. She said, "That's exactly why you need to be in a public school. Is you're in such a Christian bubble that you don't understand the need to be around the lost and to love the lost." And so middle school was pivotal for me.
Mhm.
I fell in love with the lost and really saw the urgency of the gospel for myself and for others. High school was really good for that as well. Had the opportunity to go on a few mission trips, and through that, the Lord really shaped my heart towards service and towards serving others for the sake of the gospel. And so, some of the big ones with that, I actually came down to Big Creek Mission over in Leslie County and was there 2 summers, and that was pivotal, and that's the first time I really fell in love with Appalachia. Never knew that I'd end up here for my adult life, but God did, and He's sovereignly good in that, and so, that was high school. My senior year, uh let's back up. Junior year, I made a profession of a call into ministry. Didn't have any idea what that meant, but knew that I was gonna pursue that. Senior year, chose to come to Cumberlands, and it's kind of interesting. I had walked pretty close with the Lord, middle school, high school. I can't really explain it, but the summer after my senior year, I just started having doubts and some hardships and some relational strife that I really hadn't had before. And I came to Cumberland's just really not in a good spot spiritually, not ready to be faithful on campus. And so my first semester, I came here. I had the idea that I was going to be a big bad football player. I played football all my life. Had been recruited to play here. That was really humbling. I was not on par with a lot of the guys, uh, but spiritually, I really struggled that first semester, just fitting in with the crowd, doing what everyone else was doing. Um, and by the grace of God, still had enough conviction to say I'm not going to be outside of church community. So really, I was living a double life. I was
Mm.
had my church friends, had my football friends, and just was living a double life. Thankfully, by God's grace, that was a short season. About 2 months into living that way, I really came under heavy conviction. It was like, "No, I can't live this way." And so, um, was at church and just felt heavy conviction. Went to the altar and was just praying in repentance. And one of my teammates, I'll never forget, comes up and begins to pray with me. And he asked me, like, "Hey, have you ever heard the gospel? Are you a Christian?" And like that broke my heart, tore me in half to know that this teammate who had been around for 2 months at this point had no idea I was a Christian because of the way I was living. And so that was a huge turning point in my life. From that point forward, really resolved, hey, my life is going to be solely dedicated to Christ, to his glory. Obviously, a lot of bumps in the road since then, but God has been really gracious. I've been married 9 years,
There you
and
go.
that could be a whole podcast episode. Not gonna go too far into depths with that, but marriage has been a really refining process, and I'm blessed to go on mission with my wife Hannah every single day. And so that's briefly my testimony. A lot
Mm.
more to share. But
Oh,
that's the brief part.
absolutely. Everyone's life is so intricate and deep
Yeah,
that like but that's awesome, man.
for
That's
sure.
awesome. That's a great testimony.
Yeah.
So, what made you like once you got here and like were in college, what made you like strive for campus ministries? How did that like
Yeah.
come to be that that's how you wanted to pursue ministry?
Yeah, that's really funny. Just the call into ministry in general. Yeah, some people oh, you'll have to edit that out. That's
It's
awful.
all right. It's all right.
But some people really are um feel a strong call in a very specific direction when they sense a call to ministry. That's not my story. Uh, when I said I had a call into ministry in junior year, I just meant like, hey, I don't know what the Lord's doing in my life, but vocationally, I want to pursue this. And so, campus ministries here at Cumberlands, I was involved as a student. That actually is another piece of that testimony of yeah, when I was living that double life, I was still going to the campus ministries events. I was going to Main Street Baptist here in Williamsburg, great church. And one of the people who was early on discipling me was the campus minister. That's where he went to church. And so when I came into that season of repentance and seeking to do things different, that campus minister actually started meeting with me weekly. And so that was pretty pivotal. And so from that, I did get more involved with campus ministries. I worked with our worship team doing some of the tech and audio stuff. And then I also, did some small groups and things like that throughout my time. But really, after my freshman year, I started in Res Life. I was an RA, and then I worked my way up in Res Life and ultimately became a hall director. And so as I got more involved with Res Life, I became less involved with campus ministries. I would still go to the events and things like that, but I wasn't really in any leadership role with campus ministries. I was focusing my time in Res Life. So honestly, campus ministries, although hugely beneficial to my spiritual walk, was never an area that I was actively leading in other than a very short season, and was not leading in it for a long time. I'd been doing professional life for about 7 years on other things when I was asked, kind of out of the blue, but the Lord's providence obviously was asked if I would consider the campus minister role. I was not actively seeking that.
Mhm.
At the time, I was working in the disability services here at Cumberlands. I was doing bivocational ministry on the preaching team with Cornerstone,
Right.
but really wasn't at that point pursuing a full time ministry position. I was uh, pretty excited seeing what the Lord was doing at Cornerstone, and just that bivocational ministry was really a sweet season. Uh, the previous campus minister just approached me. He said, "Hey, would you consider? I'm in a season of transition. I'm going to be taking on other responsibilities as the chair of missions and ministry. Would you consider taking on the campus minister role? And so that was 4 years ago. And so that's how I got into campus ministries leadership. Was never something on my radar. So
For
yeah.
sure. For sure. Absolutely. And so do you have to be a professor to also do like campus ministries and be the head of that, or is that something that you chose to do?
Yeah, that's something I chose to do. So that's another piece of I've always seen the classroom as something that I enjoy and something that gives me a real opportunity to get to know students, get to reach students. And so before I was even in campus ministries, I was doing some teaching in our leadership studies program here, which they've cut, which is sad. But it was a great small program that I was teaching in some of our study skills and some of those more basic classes. But I actually wasn't teaching any in missions and ministry or anything like that. So no, it's not a requirement. Um, Historically, a lot of our staff has taught in missions and ministry just because there is a lot of overlap there, but it's definitely not a requirement.
Mhm.
Um, I do think it has some benefits for
Right.
sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And so I guess the final question I'll have is how did you come to be a preacher at Cornerstone?
yeah. That's also just a really interesting, a large piece. I edited out about 5 years of my testimony, not intentionally, but like right after I graduated college, and let's kind of start there. So as I was graduating college, I knew that ministry was something I felt a calling to. Like I said, I wasn't 100% sure if that was bivocational, vocational, but definitely wanted to be deeply involved in ministry. And so the summer before my senior year, I'd served in a youth ministry internship at my home church. It had gone really well. We'd kind of left it on the table of, hey, when you graduate, there could potentially be a position here. And so we talked through that. At the time, I was very seriously pursuing a relationship with my wife, about to get engaged, and so uh, the the plan, the thought in my head, based on those conversations and things, was, hey, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to go get this job in Cincinnati as a youth pastor
Mhm.
at my home church. It's going to be a really sweet gig. Fast forward to about March, April of my senior year, which is not when you want to be finding a job. You kind of want to have those things figured out
Yeah.
beforehand. March, April of my senior year, I really did not feel peace in that decision. A couple factors. There'd been some leadership change at the church. And so they also were questioning, hey, are we going to keep this agreement that we had? Because there'd been some change and it just needed to change, I think. So that was one piece of it. Another piece of it, um, Hannah is from this area. She's from London. Her family's in Barville. She doesn't love big cities. And so honestly, it was kind of selfish of me to be like, hey, we're going to get married and you're going to move up to Cincinnati, even though
Right.
that's not what you love. And so the Lord started to convict me of like,
Mhm.
hey, maybe trust me with something even better than what seems like a really sweet gig. And so, kind of on just spiritual convictions,
Mhm.
withdrew my name from that application process, said, hey, I don't think any of us are feeling peace in this. I think y'all can find a better candidate. And kind of left it there. Have a great relationship with that church still. We're actually getting ready to visit them for a ministry partnership next weekend. So
Awesome.
still have a great relationship there, but needed to go a different direction. That's when I decided to pursue the hall director position here, which was kind of funny. Ticked some people off because I'd said, oh no, I'll never apply for a hall director job. I'm never going to do that. And then I was like the last person to apply, but I got the job.
Right.
So that was not ideal for some folks, but basically that kept me in Williamsburg. Hannah and I got married that October, and then February of the year after we got married, a former professor reached out to me and said, "Hey, there's a small church over in McCreary County, very small congregation, like 10, 15 people.
Mhm.
Um, I've been doing their interim work. Would you consider going out there and doing some fill pulpit preaching, just going and preaching here and there?" And so I was like, yeah, sure. I'm young in ministry, open to exploring those things. Uh, so what we thought was going to be a couple weeks of just going and filling the pulpit out there turned into 3.5 years of really fruitful, really beautiful ministry. The first week that we went was kind of shocking. There were 6 people there, myself and Hannah included, 6 people. We were the youngest by like 40 years,
Right.
pretty shocking to go out into that. Um, Fast forward about 3.5 years later, the church congregation has grown to
Oh,
about
yeah.
40. There's youth and children involved. There have been several professions and baptisms, and like things are going well. But we were in a season of transition. It was hard going to McCreary County 4 times a week. We were out there almost every day. It's about a 40-minute drive at the time. Hannah was working up in London. I was working full time here for the university, and we just sensed it's time for a change. And so um, as we left there, we really went into a season of exploring. Lord, we don't know exactly what you have for us. We want to serve faithfully wherever we are. So we looked for a church for about 2 or 3 months. We ended up at Cornerstone. I don't know time wise if you want a short story on that, but
Mhm.
basically, when we ended up at Cornerstone, it was really sweet. We ended up there through First Sunday. So
Oh.
that Campus Ministries does at the beginning of the year, which is really ironic. We weren't
Mhm.
involved in Campus Ministries in any way at the time, but we're like, hey, we're looking for a church. We might as well check out this First Sunday thing. And so we saw all the churches and we were really impressed the way Cornerstone presented itself of like, we don't care where you're at. Like if you come to Cornerstone, praise the Lord. But if you go somewhere else, we're praising the Lord because you're in a biblical community. And
Mhm.
we were like, yeah, that's kind of different. So let's check them out. And so we did. We ended up there. We'd been there about 6 months when their former pastor asked me, hey, I'm putting together a group of guys who can preach. I know you have preaching experience. Would you be interested in being on that preaching team?
Mhm.
And so I did that. And the Lord's sovereignty, goodness in that is just amazing because one, when I left the church in McCreary County, I knew that I wasn't done with ministry, but I also didn't know what was next, right? But trusting the Lord in that, didn't necessarily know that preaching would be a part of whatever was next. And so I was super encouraged. I didn't seek that out. And that's a theme in my life that I've just had a lot of peace with. Most of the opportunities I've sought out, I've not had. And most of the opportunities I've had, I've not sought out, which is just
Mhm.
really special. I think it shows the Lord's goodness. And so, um, ended up on that preaching team, and it's cool. The Lord was using that. That pastor was in transition. He knew he was in transition, and so what he was doing was creating a team that could hold over the preaching. And that's the current preaching team at Cornerstone. Is
Oh, really?
is those guys that you see preaching were part of that original group.
Mhm.
Josh has joined us since then and does an amazing job. But Ben, myself, and Devon were kind of part of this initial group. With Tim Cooper was the pastor, and he knew he was transitioning. He didn't break that to us until we were like starting to preach a little, and he's like, "Hey, by the way, it's time for me to transition. We're setting up a plurality of eldership." So that was Cornerstone's transition from a single head pastor to plurality of eldership at that
Mhm.
time as well. So that was summer 2020 was when all of that transition went down and started on that preaching team.
Mhm.
So yeah,
That's awesome, man. Yeah,
yeah,
that's great, and I love that that's how what's it called? Cornerstone runs it. Like that's
yeah,
was a very big attraction for me whenever
for
I
sure.
went there. I think that's awesome, and I think that's really cool that you were able to what's it called? Like you have a very diverse skill set, and so I think them what acknowledging that you have experience in preaching and
Yeah,
that you taking that position and like just kind of relying on the Lord wherever He takes you. I think that really shows your character of like to just follow the will of God, man. So I think that's awesome.
yeah,
I think that's awesome.
yeah,
And I think also when tying in all these things together, like you are a professor, you are a preacher, you do run campus ministries, you are a husband
yeah,
who like, and you do run you run the family group that I go to. You have a lot on your plate
yeah.
all the time. So now getting into, the meat and potatoes of the
Yeah.
podcast,
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
That I feel like people, me included, can very much benefit from how learning from you on how you like orchestrate your weeks and orchestrate your schedule. You have a very busy schedule,
Yeah.
to my knowledge. How do you keep that intentional?
Yeah. So I'll start with this and say the best way you can learn from me is maybe what not to do. I don't
Sure.
I don't do this super well. It's an area I'm growing for sure. One, I would say in different seasons, I've done better or worse with this, but truly, and you hear it all the time, to the point that it seems cliche, but keeping the Lord first in your priorities, right? Keeping time with the Lord as critically essential in your time and structuring your time around your time with the Lord. And that really is, and again, like I said, there are seasons that I do better with that and worse with that. And I can say, like, regularly in my life, when I'm facing burnout, when I'm coming to a point where I'm like, I'm doing too much, I feel awful, I'm not doing anything that I'm supposed to be doing. When I get down to the root issue there, it's because I've neglected meaningful time with the Lord,
Mm,
and I might still be in the Word or whatever, but I've neglected the meaningful, the intentional time, the taking that extra time in prayer, that extra time in the Word, like, and so that for me has to be critical to it. I will say a unique challenge that I've not figured out 4 years into this role is, uh, before I was in campus ministries, I had a very rigid rhythm, routine. Everything was kind of, I knew when I got up. I got up
mhm,
early. I'm a morning person. I got up early, made that intentional time with the Lord. I went to bed at a decent time, like 10:30, 11 every night. That's just not reality in campus ministries. I'm more on a student schedule, which was super fun at like 18 to 22. At just turning 30, like 1 a.m. is not as fun as it used to be. And so I'm still figuring that out. Even 4 years into it, I'm still figuring out, how do I balance rest and work? How do
mhm,
I, hey, if I'm up super late, what does it look like to be gracious and take an extra time of sleep in the morning, or to not intentionally schedule extra things in the morning so that if I do sleep in till like 6:30, 7:30, like if I sleep in till then, okay, how do I not have something right at, so that I do have that time for time with the Lord? So that's still something that I'm figuring out,
mhm,
and I do more so than I used to because of campus ministries being such a fluid schedule. I take that on a week by week basis. And so part of that, um, there's a quote, I don't know who it's by, but a failure to plan is a plan to fail. And so,
mm,
like, really, I do believe that and live by that, that each Sunday evening, so I mean, part of my Sabbath rest on Sunday is to take about an hour in our study. It's just quiet and prayer, pray over the week. Lord, show me what I need to be doing with my week.
mhm,
And then I take time and I pencil in. I'm old school. I use a like a paper planner. I have an online calendar, which I also use, but my paper planner is kind of where I cook,
right,
It's
yeah,
it's so, like, really, I take that time, pray over it, and then I line out, okay, what are the things I know I'm going to do this week? What are my class times? What are my meeting times? What are my meal times with people that I already have planned? And then from that, I see where my open spots are, and I
mhm,
plan in, okay, what are the things I have to get done, right? A lot of my jobs are administrative work.
mhm,
So with campus ministries, it's a lot of planning. It's a lot of, hey, like next week we're taking 25 students on a fall break trip. It's
mm,
going to be awesome.
right,
Uh, we have to figure out where we're going to stay, where we're going to eat, how we get tickets to the things we're going to. All those things take some logistics, and so I plan in some administrative time. Here are some quiet hours where I can work on quiet things. And then from that, I see where my other open spaces are. And I start to ask the question, okay, now where are my relational times? Right. Try to keep lunches pretty open for relational times. And at the beginning of each week, find 2 to 3 people I want to be intentional with, because that's a huge part of the campus ministry's role. Is I can't know everyone deeply. I'd love to,
absolutely,
but I want to get to know more people. And so I try to find 2 to 3 people that I don't know as well, that I want to get to know more, and reach out to them on Sunday night and say, "Hey, could you do lunch on Monday? Could you do lunch on Tuesday, whatever?" And plan that out. So that's kind of my weekly planning process.
mhm,
Does everything go according to plan every week? No. I'm terrible at sticking to the plan. Sometimes I mess that up. Um, but when I stick to that plan, I do better
mhm.
overall. And so I try to have a plan, try to stick to it, and then where that plan does get off, keeping the main thing, which is prioritizing time with the Lord.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And like I think that's a really good plan for setting up on Sundays
yeah,
or like very strict normal schedules because like over the summer for me, I like to think that I had a pretty busy schedule. It was very enjoyable and I loved
yeah,
everything that I was doing, right? But I had to work until 5 every single day through Monday through Friday. And then on Mondays, Thursdays, I would have something called college life. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, I would have a Bible study. Fridays, I would record the podcast. Saturdays, I always booked up with like friends and whatnot. Sundays, I had church in the morning, church in the evening. So
Yeah.
I was like constantly, what's it called? Doing stuff, and
Yeah.
it was lovely, I enjoyed it a lot, but I noticed that in my faith that there was a plateau because I was lacking my intentional time with God by myself that I was spending in that, and I think this is the 3rd week in a row that I've, like, talked about Ecclesiastes. I love that book with a passion,
Yeah.
and what's it called? I was not treating everything as if it was in vain, and
Mm.
I was treating everything as if it had worth and
Right.
gave me purpose, which in reality it did not
Yeah.
because God is the one who gives us worth and gives us purpose, and we are supposed to do things to glorify Him. So, how would you say that, like, obviously through campus ministries, it's a lot different than what's called like through professoring business classes
Yeah.
or what's called preaching at Cornerstone? They all kind of look different, but like, how
Yeah.
do you make sure that you glorify God above yourself in these things?
Yeah. That's a really great question. I will say, like, when I find myself out of rhythm and out of balance, 9 times out of 10, there's been a misprioritizing there and really assigning value to things that at the end of the day don't have value, right? Within each of those roles, campus ministries, preaching, teaching, all of those things, there are ways in which, if I'm not careful, even though preaching, campus ministries on the surface are serving and glorifying God, there are opportunities to glorify myself within that that can be really selfish and really get me off track in that. And so how do I keep God at the forefront? How do I glorify God? Um, one, just asking the question of what is the kingdom impact? Like that is a question that's constantly going through my mind with anything I say yes or no to is what is the true kingdom impact here? And if the kingdom impact is minimal and the time effort is maximum, I'm saying no to it, right? I'm not going to do that. Um, the other piece of glorifying God and everything that I do as opposed to making it about myself is just asking the question of, am I seeking to please God or am I seeking to please man? I love, at Cornerstone on Sunday, Ben Clayton was sharing Galatians 1:10, which is kind of a life verse for me, one that I've really committed to memory, which says, for now, am I seeking to please man or am I seeking to please God? For
Mm,
if I was still seeking to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. And it's like, that
mm,
that hits hard, right? Like, it just challenges me in everything that I do of who am I trying to please here? And like I said at the beginning, every time I'm off kilter, every time I'm unbalanced, it's because I've tried to please man or please myself instead of God. And so yeah, some of the practical ways I do that within these different roles. Within campus ministries, a huge piece that I've grown in, still not perfect in this, is learning to trust others, right?
mm,
We have a great team, like an incredible campus ministries team. Our staff works so well together. We love each other. We have fun together. Those are huge, incredible things that you want in a workplace. And so, with that, trusting them to do their jobs, trusting them to do parts of my job that I just can't get to, like, and being vulnerable enough to say, "Hey, this is technically I should probably be the one to do this, but I trust you. Could you help me with this?" You know, and that is something that's really hard for me to do, and in my pride, I hate it, but, like, I've grown in that and being able to delegate and say, like, "Look, this is something that needs to get done. I'm not gonna get it done. You can do it better than I can. Would you mind to do it for me?" And that has been
mm.
so freeing and glorifying to God because it makes it not about Jacob, right? Like
Right.
if Jacob gets everything done, then who's it for? But if we're working together to get this done, we're getting it done for the glory of God. And so that's been a huge freeing piece in the way I approach campus ministries, an area I'm still growing in. A lot of what we do in campus ministries is super fun. Like I would love to do all of it because it is so fun, but it's like I can't do it all. And so so for example, the World's Fair last week.
Mhm.
Man, I don't know if you had a chance to go to that, but that was probably one of our best events we've ever had. And Rachel took the lead on that, did such a good job. Selfishly, I wanted to be more involved in that because it is something so fun. And international ministry is kind of like my primary place where I like to serve.
Right.
Uh, but I had to just like take hands off and say, like, you got this. The Lord's got this. And it ended up being probably, like I said, our best event that we've had in a long time.
Mhm.
And one of my favorite events that we've had in a long time. And I really wasn't involved other than showing up and helping serve some food. And that was really cool, really humbling and a good reminder of I don't have to be involved in everything. And that I think that is part of how I keep the glory of God at the forefront as opposed to myself.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also echoes that you're a good leader. I'm not trying to sit here and glaze you, but
yeah,
like I think that is a very good thing because
for sure.
back back home I do contracting, right?
Okay.
And so the person who started the company is a Christian and it's a Christian based company. We're all like believers in what's it called? We are all believers saved in this company. And so every Friday we have a meeting.
Yeah.
And so there's 8 core like foundational or foundation things that we call being a high character man of God,
Okay.
right? One of which is leadership. And so whenever we were discussing the leadership piece, they were talking about how the person, our man, most of the time manager for the job site, is not going to be the one who's the best at every single thing. Now,
Yeah.
he is considerably better than me at every single aspect of the job because I'm just, not the best at it. But it's more so like he will be the one who has the confidence to actually lead and be able to do that. Leading in and of itself is its own skill set.
Yeah.
But he might not be the best at painting. He might not be the best at this or that or the other. Rachel is married to Nemo
Yeah.
and also has probably a lot of international experience herself
Exactly. Yeah.
as well. Not to say that you don't have that international experience, but it's just a matter of like, oh, well, she's in the thick of it every single
Yeah.
day. Her husband
Exactly.
is someone that's from another country. And so therefore it does make sense to have her kind of like take the leader, like have a much bigger role in this. I think that humility to do that
For
just
sure.
kind of shows that you're a good leader. I think that's something that we can all grow from in what's it called our own leadership in different ways is like knowing when to humble ourselves. Absolutely.
Yeah. Kind of on that real quick, I just
Yeah.
want to like echo that and say like that has been one of the most growing pieces of leadership for me is shifting my mindset from I have to be the best at everything to
Mm.
I want to find who's best at that and bring them on my team. I do think that the quality of a team says so much about a leader.
Mhm.
When a leader looks small, but the people around them look awesome, look big, look like they're doing amazing things, that says a lot about the leadership. And that is something that I'm continuing to grow in is I want someone who's way better than all these things than I am on my team because then they're making me better, they're making the team better, they're doing things that I couldn't do. And so that's something I teach a lot in my business classes. We do a lot of managerial things, and I'm like, the manager shouldn't be the one doing everything or the one best at everything. He should be the one. She should be the one who is bringing those people on board who can do it.
For sure. How do you do that? How do you make sure that like how
Yeah,
are you because you obviously talked about how what's called with your schedule that you
yeah,
have a relational time,
yeah,
right? Is that typically when you find these people, or is it in
yeah.
a different manner?
That's a great question. So I will say Cumberland's culture is unique in the fact that we do kind of a lot of times promote from within. We find the people here who are doing the thing and just bring them on board. That's probably not the reality in most, if you're talking about strict managerial type
Mhm.
concepts. You do have to interview and some of those things. But for me, it is one of those things that at Cumberland's, it's pretty easy to look around and say, okay, who's committed to this community? Who's um, meeting needs in this community and doing uh, really great things for the kingdom and just say, hey, would you come on board? As we have a position open, I say, hey, would you interview for this? And again, like just because we interview someone or just because I like someone or think that they have those skills doesn't necessarily mean they're the one that we hire,
Mhm.
but they're definitely considered for it because we see, oh, you're already doing this, you're already practicing this kind of personal ministry. What would it look like for you to do that for campus ministries? And so that's kind of how we approach it, at least from a campus ministries perspective.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great way to go about it. I was just kind of curious about that
Yeah,
because like with I keep on referring to the job that I have back home, but it's a
yeah,
much more like kind of based on us. It's like we are the ones who are saying, "Hey, Jude, here's this guy. I think he'd be a great fit for the team. What's
yeah,
it called?" And that type of thing, like connections through the employees. And obviously, Jude and Johnson are also going out there like
yeah,
trying to find people for their company as well.
for sure.
However, I do find that it's very interesting. Like I got brought on from my friend who was an employee there.
Yeah,
A lot of the coworkers there actually did get brought on from other fellow employees. So does that happen often? Does that take like
yeah,
a weight off of you?
for sure. So something I teach a lot in my business classes. This is one of the most cliche things you'll hear is your network is your net worth, right? Your network really does open up so many opportunities. It is kind of the key to a lot of opportunities. And when I was in my young 20s, when I was in college, and maybe even a little after college, kind of roll my eye and be like, yeah, sure, who you know matters, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
matter what you know; it matters who you know. That's a cliche we hear all the time. The more life experience I have, the more I'm like, yeah, that's actually really true. Um, uh, the best employees come from those referrals and people who know people who are doing things. There is that element of who you know, the people that I trust, the people that I have served with and experienced life with in other settings. Those are the types of people I'm looking for on teams that I'm building. And yeah, I mean, in ministry, some of our best fall awakening and spring renewal. We have our big services. We bring in an outside speaker. For a long time, we were bringing in people who maybe were regionally or nationally known. Nothing against that; those people were doing a great job. But some of our best speakers and best student feedbacks have been alumni, people that I just went to school with. Who it was kind of like when we were here and we were freshmen in college. None of us thought what's the Lord going to be doing 10, 15 years from now? Well, now I'm reaching out to those guys and being like, hey, I know that you're serving in X, Y, or Z ministry. Would you mind to come speak about that here on campus? And sometimes those are the best opportunities, are that network, those people that you know. And so, yeah, that does, and leveraging the networks of people around you. So, like you mentioned, on our team,
Mhm.
there are people who know people who then can bring those people on board, and that's huge. It definitely does take a weight off. Yeah,
Oh, absolutely. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah,
I mean, that's awesome. And I think also like with you having what's called really three major positions as well as so many other like minor.
yeah,
I say minor loosely because
yeah.
obviously being a husband is not a
Kind of
minor
the most
position.
major one,
That
but
is the most major
yeah,
one.
and I
But
miss
like
that a lot, honestly. But
what being a husband?
yeah, like that is the area where I continue to be challenged and
Mm.
grow. Like, I'm not saying that I'm a terrible husband, but that is an area that it's easy to put on the back burner, and that should be at the very forefront. So
Mm.
yeah, I just want to be honest with that.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. So how do you what's it called go about what's it called when you notice
yeah,
that you kind of putting that on the back burner? How do
yeah.
you go about remaining that intentionality with her?
For sure. And I definitely cut you off, and I will go where you were going here in a minute. But I would say some of the intentionality piece in marriage is definitely one, taking time to ask questions,
Mhm.
taking time to say, like, hey, how are you feeling about this? How are you doing? It seems super obvious, but I think when we get in our own routines and rhythms, we can forget that your spouse is also going through their routines and rhythms and their own burdens and those sorts of things. So just taking time for questions, making some intentional time each day together a priority. And day to day, that looks different. Our life is pretty hectic. And so we do have to be intentional. Meal times are a lot of times that, but we don't always eat a meal together. Like if it's a crazy day, it might be the 30 minutes before bed we're asking those questions. But making time each day to be intentional, check in on each other, um, and then having good rhythms of, we do try at least once a quarter, so once every 3 months we try to get away for a weekend. Nothing super extravagant. Really what we're doing is we're getting away, quiet, away from phones, away from distractions, to spend time together, reconnect, recharge.
Mm.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Is that something that you plan for on your Sundays? Like your Sunday evenings? Do you like plan intentional time with her? Or is it something that's kind of just like
Yeah.
uh, audible in the middle of the day? Like, hey, I got time. Trying to
Yeah,
do
yeah.
something.
I would say it's more of on the fly, and that has its benefits and its negatives. It can be unintentional, right? If I'm
Mhm.
not planning those times. A few things that we do plan into the week. So Wednesday nights are date nights, and
Okay.
so we usually keep that pretty strict. It changes year to year what our date night, but we pick a date night at the beginning of the year, and we're like, hey, we're not going to intentionally plan things for this time, and
Mhm.
so we don't do anything extravagant for those date nights. Occasionally, we'll go out on like a real nicer date, but a lot of times it's just, hey, we're gonna work a puzzle, or we're gonna we're gonna get some snacks and watch a movie together at home, or we're gonna plan out what does the next month look like. That's something that's been huge for us in the last year. Um, for a long time, I did a very poor job of including Hannah in some of the bigger picture planning, in the sense that she doesn't love budgets, numbers, those sorts of things. I love that stuff. I'm a nerd. Like, that stuff gets me excited. um, but just because she doesn't love that stuff doesn't mean she shouldn't be included in the conversation. And so For a long time, I would just do our budget and be like, "Here it is," or not even necessarily even communicate that. Just be like, "Yeah, we're doing okay financially, or we need to focus on these different things." But now it's more of a conversation. Like we have what we call our calendar date night. And with that, we do our monthly calendar and we do our budget for the month. And we do those things together once a month. Just kind of talk through like, hey, what's going well? What needs to change? Where do we want to focus this month
Mhm.
with our time and with our financial resources? So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's awesome, man.
yeah,
I think that's a great way to what's called remain intentional with her,
yeah,
and especially with like because obviously you're super busy. I'm assuming she's also super busy,
yeah.
even though she
She might be
what's called
busier than me. I don't know.
really. That I mean, there's always a chance. Always a chance. Busyness is a hard thing to measure out, but no, absolutely. But kind of like getting on what's called the pack of like I guess time management and
Hmm.
whatnot. I feel like especially because you have so many positions. Primarily, we've been discussing with your the head minister of Christian Ministries, Campus Ministries down
Yeah,
here. We have been discussing primarily, but like there's a lot of stress that
yeah,
comes with that.
yeah,
So how do you like because you briefly discussed burnout, how you'll go back to reading the Bible and get back into scripture and that
yeah,
intentionality with God. But how do you really handle in the moment that stress that you might be feeling?
yeah. So that's an area where I'm still growing. And I would say like, not to air all the dirty laundry or anything,
Sure.
but like obviously I'm very out of shape. That is an area where like I've just not taken care of my body, and I'm doing that a little more than I used to. So trajectory wise, we're in a better position than we were a year ago, let's say. But that is something that I am constantly coming back to the table. Is am I prioritizing my own spiritual and physical needs with that time with the Lord? And so I would say one way that when I catch myself going in a direction that's not good, I find myself too busy, burnt out, frustrated, stressed. I will like one seeing the warning signs, and that's an area where I think I've grown a lot. Is seeing the warning signs. If I'm overly irritable,
Mhm.
I'm probably doing too much. If I am overly stressed or worried about things that wouldn't stress or worry me, I'm probably not getting enough rest,
Mhm.
right? Um, Hands down, I will say that like if I've not slept enough in a week, I am not a fun person to be around. Like, and that's just sinful, right? But the Lord is revealing that. So catching the warning signs, I would say one
Okay.
is a piece of that. Two, then how do you respond when you see the warning signs? Um, Ways that I've grown. One, with that Sunday night planning, adding in margin, the idea of margin, which you've probably heard some of, but there's some really good resources on margin. There's a book called Crazy Busy by Kevin DeYoung. Give him a shout out
Okay.
and just say um, it's like less than 100 pages and they're half pages. So it's a really short book, good for college students. But basically one of the principles that he really hammers there is margin. Things are going to take longer than you think that they will. And so giving yourself extra time between things to make up for that margin, instead of I'm very guilty often of I will schedule my days from 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. some days, one meeting right after another, hour blocks. The reality is, especially on that relational stuff, because you don't want to shortchange relational time. I need more than an hour. I need, and if I finish early, praise God, I'll do some administrative stuff in the in between. But instead of agreeing to do something at every hour of every day, having some margin. And so, one, catch the warning signs. Two, be intentional with your planning. And then three, when I've been unintentional with my planning, when I'm seeing the warning signs, being humble enough to admit, hey, I've overcommitted, what realistically has to get done, what can be delegated, and what does not have to get done. And so, like, within that, where I will typically cut first as I look at administrative things,
Mhm.
the non relational things, those are the things that can typically either be delegated or cut out, right? Some things I'll say, hey, I can't do that this week. I'm going to reschedule. If I planned on, for example, booking out and some of the details for this fall break trip. I planned on doing them last week. I did not get time last week. Instead of crushing myself with busyness, I rescheduled and did it this morning. I was able to get it done. I scheduled time this morning that I knew I could get that done. And so rescheduling some things, And then two, delegating, finding like, hey, could someone else do this? That takes some humility to say like, hey, I'd planned on doing this, but will you do it? Can you do it? And within that, knowing your team well enough to know if they're overburdened and overloaded, I'm not going to delegate when it's a bad time,
Right.
and so like I think there has to be balance there, but certainly identifying where I've overcommitted and being willing to say, you know, I've overcommitted. I need to restructure some
Mhm.
things. That is definitely how I manage that burnout. One other piece that I've not mentioned, um, that I do a terrible job of practicing, but when I do it, I feel so much better. So a mentor of mine had shared this a couple years ago, the idea of a spiritual retreat. So having time set aside each week that is for um, getting away, some solitude, just going. It's an extended time, about 4 hours, some solitude, some planning, some prayer. Um, Now, practically, does that always work out? No. But when I do that, I feel so much better. So theoretically, that's Wednesday mornings for me.
Mhm.
So, hey, if anyone who's listening to this sees me around on campus on a Wednesday morning, working and being relational, be like, aren't you supposed to be on your spiritual retreat right now? Aren't you supposed to be in solitude? That kind of thing. And so, I mean, that has been a huge piece that when I practice that, it's sacrificial. It's sacrificial to say, "Hey, here's a morning where I'm choosing not to be around people because 'cause I'm an introvert, but I love people. I'm a weird introvert. Like,
Right.
uh, I guess I'm awkward, but I'm an extrovert. Like, I love
Okay.
being around people, but I'm awkward. So, like, for me, the idea of getting away, being totally inaccessible, like, that just makes me feel weird,
Mhm.
but it is so good when I do it,
Right.
and does help prevent some of that burnout.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it's amazing how you can walk away from that and you can feel like you have more time now because you're thinking more clearly, you're less willing to sacrifice in other ways.
Absolutely. And
So,
there's a discipline to that as
yeah.
well. And
Oh,
so
for
like
sure.
actually in all of that there's a discipline to it. So I mean like I guess how are ways that you build your discipline and
Mhm.
like maintain that because it's not like you just, kind of walked in one day with the discipline to be able to I have 8 meetings today,
Yeah.
time to lock in.
Yeah.
It's a matter of and like even I feel like in the world today there's a level of logic where flexibility is not discipline, but that is not the case. I think
Right.
it is.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of instances, if you're able to say, "Hey, I can't do this week. I have to reschedule,"
Yeah.
right? Even though you really want to, or you had the plan to get it done this week.
For
There's a
sure.
level of discipline in that. Whereas a lot of people would roll that off as, "Oh, well, you're just not getting it done," right?
Yeah.
No, you're being disciplined in getting it done still, just at a different time frame. But so back to my question, how do
Mhm.
you build your discipline and help yourself to have that in these moments?
Yeah. For sure. And I would say, discipline is exactly what it sounds like. It's not natural. It's something that you have to choose to do. Uh, like working out, like any other form of discipline, when you start, it's not comfortable, right?
Mm,
It's not something that you naturally want to do. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a discipline. And so, with time management, start small, right?
okay.
Identify, hey, where am I lacking in this? I think knowing the problem is half the battle. And so, asking the questions of where am I stressed? Where am I overwhelmed? Where am I not managing my time well? Helps you then say, okay, what are small, measurable? Measurable is important. I have to be able to actually say, am I doing this or am I not? Goals that will help me be more disciplined. Um, Without crossing into legalism, I will say I've never quite understood the person who says, I don't need a planner or I don't need some, it doesn't have to be a paper planner, but I don't need some sort of schedule. I've never quite understood how that person is functioning. And so I would challenge and say, look at your week. Like, do you have rhythms? Do you have, and maybe it's all up here, maybe it's all in your head and you don't have it written out, but all of us are practicing some sort of rhythm, some sort of routine, some sort of schedule. And so evaluating that and being like, okay, how am I using my time? Okay, how would I like to use it differently? And then making small measurable goals from that. So I think that's how you start the discipline, and then accountability, having people who are going to ask you questions of like, hey, how are you using your time? Are you making time for yourself? Are you making time for your, and when I say yourself, I mean time with the Lord and
Right.
yourself, not selfish, like, yeah,
Desires, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
But are you making time to take care of yourself spiritually, to find that time with the Lord? Are you making time to be sacrificial, to serve others, to build new relationships, to get out of your comfort zone? So are you making time
Mhm.
for others? And we need people asking those questions. So,
Absolutely,
yeah.
for sure, and I think that's what's it called, very good methods for building discipline.
Yeah.
Like, I think, like for me, I've built discipline through going to the gym, but in that same sense, is that not just time management? Like, am
Yeah.
I not just setting out another hour and a half, 2
Absolutely.
hours of time where
Yeah.
I could do that? Where yes, I am also like mentally pushing my body to a limit that I don't like.
Right.
Typically, it's uncomfortable,
For
right?
sure.
But I think it is a sense of time management, and I think another interesting thing you mentioned that Sunday is your Sabbath, and you try to
Yeah.
keep that day holy, right? But
Yeah.
with such a busy schedule and with what's it called, trying to make sure everything is fit into it, you're not even using a 7-day week at that point. You're using essentially a 6-day one.
Yeah.
So what's called, how's the discipline and how does your Sabbath day typically go? How do you hold on to that and maintain that?
For sure. Yeah. And that's a great question. It's one of those that, um, one, I want to be really clear of not crossing into legalism because I
Mhm.
think it's easy to do that.
For sure.
But at the same time, rest is holy. And if we're not making a priority of time alone with the Lord or time, even with, Sabbath, like if we're not truly taking Sabbath, taking rest with the Lord and with our families, then we can become quickly overburdened. And so some of the ways that I do that, um, I need to do better in this. So part of my rhythm within that, and this is gonna sound so shallow, but I do enjoy. I find things that I enjoy, and this is not necessarily directly worship. Like it's definitely not directly worshiping the Lord, but I do. Every week I watch the Bengals,
Yeah, there you go.
that is something that I know is although it's not always very stress relieving to watch the Bengals play, but that is something that, hey, after church on Sunday, I kind of that is a time that I'm a little inaccessible, and then in that evening time after that, I do spend time with Hannah. We usually have an intentional meal together on Sunday evening. That's one of the more quiet times of the week that we spend together, and then that after dinner time is really spent in rest, reflection, planning for the week to come. Um, and like I mentioned, a reflection of the previous week. Hey, what went well? What didn't go so well? What do I need to um, do differently? One other piece of that, another way I protect that time, and it's not always on Sunday, uh, but trying to make sure that I am getting other things done before Sunday night so that it's not that I'm just grinding on Sunday night. So specifically within that grading as a professor,
Right.
that's my I love I'm a terrible sometimes I'm like I'm a terrible professor because I love teaching. I don't know how I feel about grading yet.
Right.
Which is like a large piece of teaching,
Yeah.
and so I do try to stay on a rhythm, a schedule of teaching, particularly grading. So right now, what I've worked out is my heaviest class load for grading is the New Testament class that I teach.
Mhm.
So they have 3 assignments a week. I try to pick one day for each of those assignments. So I get all these done on this day, all the others done on another day. Does it always work out that way? No. But trying to have some sort of rhythm there so that it's not like on Sunday evening I'm spending 6 hours grading because
Right.
that's not very restful.
No. No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you have any other closing thoughts?
I don't think so. Again, I think that, it's just incredible to see how the Lord is working in our weaknesses and, has designed us to be, creatures who need rest, who need rhythms. It reminds us that we're dependent upon the Lord. If I'm constantly doing things in my own strength, I'm gonna burn out. But if I am practicing this rhythm of rest and I'm practicing, just a knowledge of my limitations, that is glorifying to God. To be
Mm,
aware of my limitations, say, I can't do everything that I wanna do in the timeline that I want to do it, but God is working even when I'm not. So that I guess that would be a closing thought is learn to be okay with what you can't do and trust the Lord to do even abundantly more than you ever could.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for coming on the
for
podcast,
sure.
Jacob. It's been lovely having you discussing this with you. We're gonna have Devon on next week, right? Lord willing, of course, right? There's been some schedule things, totally understandable. Busy people,
Yeah.
busy things, absolutely. But if you want to watch the video podcast for this. It's Two Creations, One Creator official on YouTube. But I guess that really does it for today. I'll see y'all next week. It's always a pleasure having you guys listen. But have an enjoyable week. Love y'all. See ya.